Rain fell in jagged sheets that afternoon, hammering the cracked pavement with a rhythm that felt almost alive, almost accusatory. She saw them first from the corner of her eye, two tiny shivering forms huddled beneath a rusted dumpster, their fur matted with mud and rainwater, their whimpers a fragile plea she couldn't ignore. The smell hit her before anything else, damp fur, wet earth, the sour tang of fear, and her chest tightened in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her hands itched to reach out, but the instinct that had kept her careful, kept her cautious, whispered not to get too close. Yet something in the quiver of their tiny bodies, the way their eyes, liquid, hopeless pools, locked on her own, pulled her forward. Every step toward them felt like breaking through a wall of sorrow she didn't know she carried herself. In that moment, she realized that rescue wasn't just about saving them. It might also be about saving herself. The rain was relentless that afternoon, pounding against the cracked pavement with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, almost sentient, as though the world itself was weeping. She moved slowly, cane tapping against the stones, each strike echoing hollowly in the empty street. Her coat was soaked through, clinging to her shoulders like a second skin, and the wind cut across her face in sharp, cold slices. She hated days like this, gray, dripping melancholy, but something inside her insisted she walk, as if movement could outrun memories she hadn't yet admitted to herself. Then she heard it, a tiny, quivering whimper, almost swallowed by the storm. She froze mid-step, ears straining, heart thudding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. The sound came again, fragile, pleading, and it carried with it a weight she couldn't ignore. She glanced down the alley beside the crumbling brick wall and saw them, two tiny shapes huddled beneath a rusted dumpster, soaked, shivering violently as if the cold itself were trying to squeeze life from them. Mud caked their paws and stained their fur in streaks of brown and black. One of them lifted a trembling head, eyes wide, large as marbles, reflecting the gray sky above in a way that made her stomach twist. She wanted to turn away. She wanted to tell herself it wasn't her problem. She had lived a long life of careful avoidance, building walls around her heart after decades of loss. But those eyes, so small, so fragile, spoke in a language she couldn't unhear. They were calling her name, though she had never met them before. Every instinct screamed caution. Every rational thought warned of risk, of responsibility, of the inevitable heartbreak. And yet she stepped forward, letting the rain wash her hesitation away. Each footfall was deliberate, careful, as though she could somehow communicate safety with nothing more than movement. The closer she got, the more tangible their fear became. She could see the tiny ribs pressing through fur, feel the sharp pang of hunger and cold. One of the puppies whimpered again, the sound breaking through the ambient roar of the storm, and she found herself speaking softly, almost instinctively. "It's okay, little ones. It's okay," or shaky. Her words were shaky, barely more than a whisper against the rain, but she felt the weight of them. She crouched low, letting her hands hover over them, not yet touching, but offering presence. She could see the smallest one, a brindle speck with a trembling nose, inch forward first. Its tiny paws slipped in the mud, claws scraping, ears flat against its head. It hesitated, then nudged the warmth of her palm with a tentative sniff. Her heart clenched. The other puppy stayed behind it first, curling tighter, shivering violently, letting out a pitiful whine whenever the wind gusted through the alley. She shifted her weight slightly, murmuring reassurances, and gradually it too crawled forward. When its nose finally met her fingers, it trembled for a moment, then pressed against her hand. A small weight that felt infinitely heavy with trust. The rain softened around them. Or maybe it was just her perception, each droplet a muted percussion, less insistent now. She felt an odd sense of stillness, as if time itself had paused to witness the fragile bond forming in the muck of that alley. She couldn't just leave them there. The world outside might be cruel, indifferent, even dangerous, but she had the capacity, however small, to offer safety. Carefully, she scooped them one by one into her coat, feeling their tiny hearts hammer against her chest. They were wet, heavy with rain and trembling, and their scent damp fur, mud, fear, mixed with the familiar aroma of her own coat, carrying memories she had long forgotten. The sharp tang of old kitchens, the softness of blankets in empty rooms, the lingering scent of someone lost. She swallowed a lump of emotion she didn't have the words to name. The walk home was slow and deliberate, each step an exercise in patience and balance. The rain had turned to drizzle, falling in fine threads that clung to hair and eyelashes. that clung to hair and eyelash. The city seemed muted, washed in gray and silver, the sidewalks glistening like molten glass. Passers-by hurried past, umbrellas bobbing, oblivious to the small drama unfolding at the edge of the street. She imagined the stories these tiny bodies carried, histories of hunger, neglect, and abandonment. Her chest ached with the recognition that they had endured far more than they should ever have had to. By the time she reached her small apartment, she was soaked to the bone. The weight of the puppies pressing against her arms like the gravity of a secret too heavy to bear alone. She set them down gently on an old quilt, the soft fabric absorbing the water that clung to their fur. They trembled still, pressing against each other as if to share courage. She knelt beside them, brushing muddy fur from their paws with trembling fingers, whispering the same words over and over. "You're safe now. You're safe." It felt ridiculous to speak to such tiny creatures, yet the rhythm of her voice seemed to calm them, coaxing life back into bodies that had known so little comfort. The room smelled of damp wood and old books, the faint trace of cooking oils from meals past, and it became a sanctuary, however fragile. She draped a towel over their shivering bodies, wrapping them in warmth as the storm outside continued its relentless descent. One of the puppies pressed its nose against her chest, eyes closing in tentative relief. She let herself exhale, a slow, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for decades. The feeling was dizzying in its simplicity. She had done something. She had acted. She had shown kindness in a world that often forgot how to notice the small and vulnerable. Hours later, she lay on the floor beside them, listening to their soft, rhythmic breaths mingling with the muted patter of rain against the windows. She allowed herself to think about the past, regrets, losses, moments where she had been too cautious, too reserved. The puppies slept pressed against her side, tiny bodies radiating warmth, and she felt a flicker of something long dormant. Hope. Not the grand, sweeping kind of hope reserved for fairy tales, but the quiet, stubborn hope that comes from being needed and being able to give in return. Outside the storm raged, but inside there was quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something gentler, softer. Trust, fledgling and fragile. She realized then that rescue was never truly one-sided. They had saved her as much as she had saved them, pulling her from the edges of her own solitary grief and into the messy, unpredictable, yet profoundly beautiful reality of care. The tiny whimpers that had first caught her attention were gone, replaced by small sighs of relief. The rise and fall of chests that carried with them a promise that even in the darkest storms, a small light could be found, and sometimes it came in the shape of two tiny, trembling puppies seeking warmth in the rain. She pressed her forehead gently against the smaller one, feeling its heartbeat echo her own, and whispered, "We'll get through this together." Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, a fragile sense of peace had taken root. One heartbeat, one tremble, and one small act of courage at a time. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she had found a reason to hope again. The apartment smelled of old wood and faint traces of tea, the kind left to steep too long, but it was warm and quiet, a small refuge from the relentless storm outside. She set the puppies down on a faded quilt, watching them pause, noses twitching, ears flat against their tiny heads as they took in the strange new environment. The air inside was thick with the scent of her own memories, the faint trace of mothballs from cupboards left untouched for months, the lingering aroma of books stacked haphazardly on shelves, and the comforting familiar tang of home that contrasted sharply with the damp, bitter alley where she had found them. She knelt on the floor, brushing mud from their tiny paws, feeling the uneven tremor of their bodies beneath her fingers. Every shiver seemed magnified in the silence. Every blink and tilt of the head waited with caution, with fragile trust. They had not known comfort for long, if at all. The smallest puppy flinched at her slightest movement, retreating under the edge of the quilt, while the other paced in tiny, uneven circles, sniffing everything with suspicion. She understood without thinking that the process of healing would require patience, a slow, deliberate weaving of safety and trust. She carried them to the kitchen, warmed a small bowl of water, and prepared a meager meal of soft bread soaked in milk. The scent seemed foreign to them, and they hesitated, noses twitching in suspicion, ears pinned back in wariness, yet hunger won over fear. And as they began to eat, she noticed the tension in their shoulders ease ever so slightly, a subtle promise that perhaps the world was not all danger. that there might be pockets of safety, however fragile. The rain tapped insistently against the windows, a constant reminder of the storm outside and the vulnerability it had carried. She placed a folded blanket in a corner, creating a tiny nest for them, and watched as they investigated cautiously, noses brushing, paws testing, small whines of uncertainty breaking the quiet. One of the puppies, emboldened by the warmth of the quilt and her presence, nudged its sibling toward her side. Together, they huddled against her knees, small quivering forms that carried the weight of abandonment, fear, and cold nights too long endured. She reached out, gently stroking their fur, whispering words of reassurance she had not expected to speak aloud. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you." Night fell quickly, thick and suffocating outside the rain-streaked windows. The city seemed to disappear beneath sheets of gray, leaving only the small circle of light cast by a single lamp in the apartment. She sat on the floor beside the puppies, their tiny bodies curled against her legs, and listened to their soft, uneven breathing. The smallest one twitched, paws flexing in sleep, and she realized that for the first time in weeks, or perhaps months, they were not clinging desperately to life, but beginning to feel it. Each twitch, each sigh, each tentative wag of a tail was a quiet victory, a flicker of trust being lit in a world that had almost extinguished it. As the night deepened, she reflected on her own solitude. Her life had been a series of carefully maintained routines, walls built against disappointment and loss. She had grown accustomed to quiet, to absence, to the steady pulse of loneliness that had become her companion. Yet now, as she watched the puppies curl into each other, their small forms casting soft shadows on the floor, she felt an unfamiliar tug at her chest, a blend of protectiveness, tenderness, and a fragile kind of hope. It was unsettling, this sudden awakening of emotion, but she welcomed it. She understood instinctively that love required vulnerability, that the act of caring demanded a letting go of rigid defenses. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through heavy curtains that kept the city's chaos at bay. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the gray clouds, scattering soft, pale beams across the apartment floor. The puppies stirred, stretching tiny limbs and yawning, eyes blinking in wonder at this strange, bright world. They explored cautiously, sniffing the corners, brushing against her legs for reassurance. Each movement, each hesitant step felt monumental, a declaration that they were beginning to trust, beginning to feel at home. She offered them fresh water and food, sitting quietly as they ate, her presence a silent promise that this was a place of safety, of warmth, of quiet constancy. Time passed in measured increments, marked by small victories and subtle gestures. The puppies learned the rhythm of the apartment, the location of the kitchen, the softness of the quilt in the corner, the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor. Each new day brought with it tiny triumphs. A wag of a tail, a tentative approach, a small lick offered to her hand. These moments, seemingly insignificant, carried immense weight. She celebrated each one in silence, a quiet witness to the fragile blossoming of trust. And in turn, she felt herself changing, her own heart uncoiling from the tight knots of decades spent alone. The neighborhood outside remained indifferent, occasionally harsh. Rain-soaked garbage piled along the curbs. Cars honked impatiently. Neighbors shouted across streets, too busy to notice the small dramas of life. Inside, however, a delicate ecosystem had begun to thrive. The warmth of shared breaths, the rhythmic scraping of paws across the floor, the faint scent of damp fur blending with the apartment's familiar aromas. It all became a tapestry of life, a counterpoint to the storm beyond the walls. She realized that the act of creating safety was not a single moment, but a sustained, ongoing effort, requiring attention, patience, and a willingness to absorb the fears and uncertainties of those in her care. Evenings were particularly tender. She would sit on the floor, reading aloud from old novels or whispering fragments of songs she remembered from long ago, while the puppies listened with rapt attention, heads tilted, ears flicking at every intonation. Their eyes, once wide and fearful, now held sparks of curiosity and intelligence, softening the hard edges of their past suffering. They had begun to adapt, to understand the contours of this new world, and in doing so, they were teaching her how to inhabit it more fully, to breathe without the constant weight of solitude pressing on her chest. And so, shelter was not merely a physical space, but a state of being. The apartment became a crucible of trust and growth, a haven where fear could be set aside and replaced with tentative hope. Through the careful tending of two tiny lives, she found herself rediscovering the capacity for empathy, for patience, for courage. She realized that rescue was not only about saving others, but about allowing oneself to be saved in return, and that love, fragile and insistent, could be cultivated in the smallest, quietest of spaces. As night fell once more, she watched the puppies curl together, tiny forms pressed against the quilt in her leg. Nights when one of them whimpered in the dark, trembling at imagined shadows, or mornings when the smallest puppy refused to eat, retreating into a corner as if the world had conspired to frighten it anew. Each moment of fear or resistance tested her patience, demanding more than she thought she could give. Yet she met it with quiet persistence, kneeling on the floor, brushing fur from paws, murmuring assurances that were at once both directive and gentle. "It's okay, I'm here. You're safe. You're loved." And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they learned that these promises were real, that touch could heal, and that love could be steady, even when the world outside raged with uncertainty. Through this process, she began to notice the changes in herself. The tightness in her chest, long held as a defense against disappointment, began to loosen. She laughed softly when the puppies played, a sound she hadn't made in years, and she felt a deep, unspoken gratitude for their presence. Their small victories, the first wag of a tail, the first leap onto her lap, the soft lick of recognition, carried immense weight. She realized that nurturing another life demanded vulnerability, and in offering it, she had discovered a reservoir of patience, courage, and tenderness that she had thought lost. The bond deepened during quiet routine. Bath time, once a stressful ordeal, became a ceremony of care. Water warmed just enough, towels soft and inviting. She watched their tiny bodies, slick with water, skin and fur fragile beneath her hands, and marveled at their resilience. Their trust deepened with each gesture, each whispered word, each careful brush of the fur. She had become attuned to their subtleties. The tilt of a head, the flicker of an ear, the way they followed her across the room, learning the language of quiet connection that required patience, observation, and immense tenderness. Evenings stretched long, with the three of them lying close together, the puppies nestled against her side as she read aloud, the apartment filled with soft, rhythmic breathing. Occasionally, one would stir, nudging her hand or pressing its nose against her chest, and she would respond, brushing fur from its ears, murmuring reassurances that were as much for her as for them. She noticed almost imperceptibly that her own movements had softened, her voice had found a gentleness it had long forgotten, and her heart had begun to open to a kind of joy she had deemed impossible. Outside, the city continued in its indifferent pace, rain or shine, storm or calm. Yet within these four walls, a sanctuary had emerged, defined not by grandeur or luxury, but by the quiet, unyielding commitment to care. It was a lesson in resilience, patience, and the transformative power of love. The apartment walls held witness to countless tiny moments of growth. A playful chase across the floor, a hesitant approach to the kitchen counter, a tentative lick offered to her hand. These moments, each small, collectively reshaped the fabric of her life, stitching together a sense of purpose and connection she had long believed lost. The puppies thrived, not merely surviving but beginning to flourish. Their personalities emerged with vivid clarity, the mischievous spark in the older one, the tender curiosity of the younger. She watched them explore the sunlit corners of the apartment, noses twitching, ears flicking, tails wagging in tentative delight, and she marveled, silently, at the miracle of their resilience, at the quiet majesty of trust reborn. She realized that healing was not a destination but a journey, one measured in small victories and tender moments, in the slow accumulation of trust and the gentle unfolding of love. At night, when she finally settled beside them, exhaustion heavy but heart full, she allowed herself a rare indulgence, to reflect on the enormity of the change. A week ago, these tiny bodies had trembled in the rain, abandoned and afraid. Now they nestled against her chest, warm and trusting, and she felt the full, unspoken weight of what had been achieved. Not just survival, but growth, connection, and the slow reclamation of life itself. The apartment, once a place of silence and solitude, had become a sanctuary, not only for them, but for her as well. In the quiet moments before sleep, she pressed her hand against the smallest puppy, feeling its heartbeat steady, slow, and rhythmic. She whispered softly words meant for both the puppies and herself. "We are safe, we are home, and we will face the world together." The puppies stirred slightly, snuggling closer, And she understood that the healing they had begun together was a shared journey, one that would shape each of their lives profoundly. Outside, the night continued. Rain softened into a gentle patter, but inside there was warmth, trust, and the quiet, unstoppable pulse of life renewed. The apartment felt impossibly quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that presses against the ears until every small sound becomes amplified. A single drip from the leaky kitchen tap echoed through the space like a metronome, and she could hear her own breath, slow and deliberate, attempting to steady the unease gnawing at her chest. The puppies were restless, pacing the worn wooden floor, ears flicking at the faintest noises from the street below. Something in the air felt off, though the rain outside had softened into a delicate drizzle. She didn't yet know it, but life was about to remind her that safety, no matter how carefully built, was never guaranteed. It started with a cough, a sharp, wet sound from the smallest puppy that sliced through the morning calm. She froze, heart hammering, as the puppy staggered slightly, tail tucked tightly between its legs. Panic clawed at her chest, a familiar weight she thought she had left behind. The puppy's eyes, wide and glistening with vulnerability, locked onto hers, and she felt a surge of helplessness, raw and unfiltered. It was one thing to feed them, to dry them, to watch them explore a safe space, but it was another to confront their fragility, their mortality, head-on. She scooped the trembling creature into her arms, feeling the rapid thrum of its tiny heart against her chest. The other puppy pressed close, as if sensing the fear, offering comfort in the only way it could. Warmth, presence, solidarity. The walk to the veterinarian was agonizing, each step weighted with dread. The city outside moved in indifferent rhythms, cars honking, neighbors shouting, umbrellas bouncing through puddles. But she existed in a bubble of acute focus, attuned only to the fragile life in her arms. The small body shook violently, and she murmured constant reassurances, though the words felt fragile and insufficient against the magnitude of her fear. The air was thick with the scent of rain and mud, mingling with the antiseptic tang of the clinic waiting room. She gripped the tiny body closer, feeling the steady beat of trust that, even in crisis, had begun to anchor them together. Hours passed in a blur of examinations, whispered reassurances, and anxious pacing. The veterinarian's calm, practiced words offered little comfort as she absorbed the small clinical gestures that could mean life or loss. Every soft whine, every tremor felt magnified in her chest. She realized with a kind of brutal clarity that love was inseparable from vulnerability. To care meant to risk heartbreak, and to protect meant to confront fears she could not entirely control. And yet, even in this terrifying liminality, the puppies clung to her, pressing their warmth into her hands, into her chest, as if promising that they would endure together. When they returned home, night had fallen thickly outside. The city lights shimmered through the rain-streaked windows, casting distorted patterns across the walls. She arranged a small nest of blankets in the corner and placed the smallest puppy carefully inside, brushing wet fur from its ears and whispering soothing words. Its eyes, wide and anxious, eventually softened as it curled into the quilt, still trembling but alive. The other puppy pressed close, its tiny body radiating warmth and reassurance. Together they formed a fragile triad of trust and resilience, a bond strengthened in the crucible of fear. Yet the storm was not merely outside the apartment walls. In the days that followed, minor crises tested the limits of her patience and courage. A neighbor complaining about noise, a bowl overturned in the middle of the night, or a sudden bout of fear that sent the puppies running in panic. Each incident required measured calm, gentle guidance, and the constant reminder that their sanctuary was not fragile. It was fortified by trust, consistency, and presence. She discovered within herself a depth of patience she had not realized she possessed, a capacity to absorb chaos and fear without fracturing. And slowly, imperceptibly, the puppies absorbed that stability, learning that the world could be navigated with courage when there was someone steady to lean on. The storm inside her own mind mirrored the external one. Memories long buried clawed at the edges of consciousness. The loss of loved ones, the betrayals, the quiet years of solitude. The puppies had become mirrors for her own vulnerability, reflecting back her fears and insecurities in the raw ache of her heart. And in caring for them, she confronted herself. Each nurturing gesture became a meditation, each gentle touch a prayer, each moment of patience a reclamation of her own lost capacity for trust. She realized that rescue was a two-way street. While she had saved them from physical danger, they were simultaneously saving her from emotional stagnation, breathing life into spaces she had long abandoned. There were nights of tears, too. When the smallest puppy coughed or whined, or the older one howled at a shadow cast by a flickering street lamp, she cried softly beside them, pressing her forehead to their tiny bodies. The warmth of their fur, the rhythm of their hearts, the gentle rise and fall of their breathing, it all became a balm against the lingering sting of grief she carried. And she learned in those tender hours that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to stay, to nurture, and to love despite uncertainty. Through these trials, the puppies grew not just in body, but in spirit. They learned the rhythms of the apartment, the warmth of human touch, the gentle safety of a voice that never raised in anger. Playtime became an exploration of joy, each bark and scamper a declaration of newfound confidence. Yet they still carry the faint tremor of fear, subtle but persistent, a reminder of the fragility that life had once demanded of them. And she, too, felt the tension ease in her own chest as they learned that love was not fleeting, that safety could be constant, and that the world, while often harsh, could also be tender. One evening, after a particularly stressful day filled with minor accidents and sudden scares, she sat on the floor with both puppies nestled against her legs. The rain outside had slowed to a soft patter, the streetlights shimmering through wet windows like fractured gold. She ran her hands over their tiny bodies, feeling the warmth, the slight tension in their muscles, and the steady, trusting beat of their hearts. She realized that the storm, both within and without, had served a purpose. It had revealed the depth of connection possible when vulnerability was met with patience, presence, and love. They had endured together, survived together, and begun to thrive together. The night stretched long, but it was no longer oppressive. The puppies slept, curled into each other, and her own legs, tiny bodies rising and falling with even, slow breath. She leaned back against the wall, exhausted but profoundly aware of the transformation that had occurred in these months. Fear and uncertainty had been present, always, but they had been met with tenderness, care, and unwavering commitment. And in the quiet aftermath, she recognized a truth she had long avoided. Resilience was not born from isolation or avoidance, but from shared vulnerability, mutual trust, and the willingness to face storms, both within and without, together. The storm had passed for now. Yet in the soft golden light of the apartment, she could see its imprint. The tiny victories, the quiet gestures of courage, and the profound growth that had occurred in all of them. The puppies were no longer trembling, cautious creatures, but small beings capable of trust, joy, and play. She too had been transformed, discovering patience, courage, and a capacity for tenderness that she had long believed lost. Together, they had navigated fear, uncertainty, and pain, emerging not unscathed but stronger, bound by love that had been forged in the crucible of challenge. And as she pressed a hand gently against the smallest puppy, feeling its warmth, its steady heartbeat, she whispered softly, "We have weathered the storm, and we will face whatever comes next together." Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and relentless, but inside the apartment, a sanctuary had been carved from fear and uncertainty. Trust had been built, love had been nurtured, and the small family, fragile yet unbreakable, had discovered the quiet, transformative power of shared courage. Morning arrived softly, without fanfare, as if the world had waited patiently for this particular day to unfold. Light spilled in through the curtains in gentle amber swaths, touching the walls, the floor, and the tiny forms curled against her legs. The puppies stirred, stretching in the warm, quiet glow, tails flicking with anticipation, noses twitching as they explored their familiar surrounding. They were no longer trembling creatures of fear. They moved with a tentative confidence, testing the limits of their world with a curiosity tempered by trust. She watched them, heart swelling, and realized that what had begun as rescue had grown into something far greater, a profound shared belonging. The apartment, once a mere shelter, now radiated life. The faint scent of dried blankets, mingled with the subtle musk of fur and the lingering aroma of her own meals, filled the air. Each sound, the scuff of tiny paws, the gentle sniffing at corners, the soft whine of a discovery, was a symphony of resilience. Even the light from the rising sun seemed softer, warmer, as though the world had conspired to honor this fragile sanctuary. She knelt beside them, brushing fur from their ears, smiling at the small victories that had accumulated into something extraordinary. A world made safe by care, patience, and unwavering presence. She reflected on the journey that had brought them here, the rain-soaked alley, the trembling whimpers, the sleepless nights filled with worry and whispered reassurances. Every fear faced, every trembling paw soothed, every cautious advance toward trust had been a step toward this moment. She felt a quiet gratitude, not just for the puppy's survival, but for the way they had drawn her out of solitude, teaching her the value of patience, the power of love, and the transformative strength of shared vulnerability. Theirs was not merely a story of rescue. It was a story of mutual healing, of lives intertwined and hearts mended through devotion. The puppies bounded across the floor, exploring the apartment with newfound confidence, noses sniffing at corners and tails wagging in delight. She laughed softly, a sound that felt foreign and yet familiar, a long-forgotten echo of a joy once known. Finally, she lay back on the floor, the puppies curled against her, the sun spilling warmth across their tiny bodies. She pressed a hand gently against the smallest one, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath her fingers, and whispered softly, "We belong here, together." The words, simple yet profound, carried the weight of every fear faced, every tear shed, every moment of trust earned. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and relentless, but inside, in this sanctuary of light, warmth, and hearts intertwined, there was peace, there was joy, there was the quiet, unwavering power of belonging. For the first time in what felt like forever, she understood that endings were never truly endings. They were beginnings written in trust, whispered in soft fur, and lived in the steady rhythm of tiny hearts. The puppies stirred slightly, pressed close, tails flicking, breath slow and even, and she knew that this dawn, the warmth, the light, the belonging, was not a fleeting gift but the beginning of a life reclaimed. Life, fragile yet fierce, had finally settled in their favor, and she too had been reclaimed by it. In the soft glow of morning, with the puppies nestled around her, she felt it in every bone, every breath, every heartbeat. They had found home, and so had she.